The Soviet T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was a myth, maybe even a legend. With its sloped armor, inexpensive price tag, and immense firepower, it became the backbone of Soviet forces. Yet more than 50% of all T-34 tanks were wiped out, becoming a steel coffin for its crew. But how did such an incredible weapon turn into the ultimate death trap? By 1939, the Soviet Union was primarily operating the T-26 heavy tank and BT series of faster tanks. But behind the scenes, Joseph Stalin had fallen in love with a new form of warfare. Called the warfare of annihilation, it was a tactic that focused on a fast strike. Instead of slowly moving into the enemy's position, this tactic allowed the Soviets to quickly enter a combat zone and fully destroy the enemy in as little time as possible. Yet his industrialization plan of the 1930s meant that the design of the BT series and T-26 was not really conducive to how the Soviets wanted to conduct warfare. Stalin realized this in 1938 during the Battle of Lake Khasan and the 1939 battles of Khalkhin Gol. Here, the Soviet came face to face with the diesel-powered IJA Type 95 Hargo used by Japan. While it might have been a light tank, each hit from the Japanese sent the Soviet tanks spiraling into a fireball, even when hit with something as simple as a Molotov cocktail. But behind the scenes, Red Army engineer Mikhail Koshkin was already at work designing a new prototype for the Soviet Union. His first version, known as the A-20, was one of the first tanks to feature sloped armor. And it worked. However, mass production would have been expensive due to a lack of technology. Then, after the losses to the Japanese, Koshkin convinced Stalin to give him another shot. And what he'd come up with would become the most iconic tank of the war. It didn't take long for A-32 to be created as the new prototype, featuring 32mm of frontal armor, and a L-1076.2mm gun was put on the battlefield, tested during the 1939 field trials in Kubinka. Yet even this wasn't enough, and following its successes on the battlefield, it took another round of design for Koshkin to come up with the even wider tracked version, featuring 45mm of sloped armor and the newer L-1176.2mm gun. This ultimately became what is known as the T-34, named after 1934 when Koshkin began formulating his ideas for a new tank. By January 1940, as the Second World War was already in full swing, the first two prototypes of the T-34 were ready for Kremlin leaders, and they'd be given a grueling mission of driving from Kharkiv to Moscow, then the Mannerheim Line in Finland, and finally back to Kharkiv via Minsk and Kiev. Minor issues were identified and all corrected, but just as the T-34 was finally put in production in September 1940, its designer sadly wouldn't live to see it, falling to pneumonia just a few days earlier. Yet his design was ready for the front lines, and learning from the blitzkrieg tactics used by the Germans, the T-34 was ready. On June 22, 1941, the Axis turned its aim to the east, with Hitler citing the Soviet Union as the best option for expansion. The Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, where they stormed the Soviet lines. Back in Moscow, only about 900 T-34s were ready for combat, with about 500 KV-1s and thousands of BT and T-26 tanks. Most of these lighter and older tanks were stationed on the front lines, and when the Germans attacked, the Panzer IV made light work of these box-shaped tanks that the Soviets were pushing forward. Yet as the Germans pushed deeper, they finally came into contact with the T-34. The Germans were caught off guard, firing shell after shell of the Panzer III's 37mm rounds, and all of them simply bounced off the armor. It made the T-34 virtually impervious to anything the Germans threw at it, but inside the tanks, the crews operating them were absolutely useless. Since it hadn't seen any real combat, the T-34 and its crews didn't really know how to operate the tank. They were given just 72 hours of training, while no radios on the battlefield meant that flags and signals were the only way to communicate. It became a slaughterhouse for the Soviets, as the combat experience of the Germans quickly kicked in from previous experience facing the Matilda and Char B-1, and they simply changed back to using these tactics. The T-34 tactics were so bad that at the start of the war, it could only fire about 2 rounds per minute, and the only way for the commander to see the outside was through a small periscope. Moreover, its angled armor also proved one of its biggest weaknesses. You see, by sloping the armor, the Soviets reduced the space inside the tank, meaning that fewer crew members could be used. It meant that each person in the tank had numerous jobs, whereas the German Panzer IV had a single crewman responsible just for reloading the turret. The steel alloy was also rather brittle, meaning that it would simply break off or splinter from normal shelling, further hindering the crew from moving at great speeds. Finally, the ammunition was a problem, prone to catching fire and forcing the crew to get out of the tank to extinguish it. In fact, being one of the three-man crew was deadly by itself. It had awkward hatches for the driver and the commander, while the gunner would have to pray that he could make it out in time if they had to bail. The tanks were so dangerous that if your legs were in the wrong place, you might lose them. The Germans all capitalized on this, realizing the T-34 was a powerful weapon. They knew tactics would be its downfall. But the Soviets were not just going to take these losses, and the Germans pushed deeper into Moscow. Tank factories were moved, and massive upgrades would change the battlefield. Having lost more than 20,000 tanks in 1941 alone, the Soviets needed to replace them, but they had to be replaced much faster than the previous T-34. So the Soviets essentially stripped out everything they could, including the driver's seat, since he could drive without one. They doubled the thickness of the armor and even removed the rubber on road wheels. This cut production costs by a whopping 40%, allowing them to produce a massive 1,200 tanks per month. This meant that the Soviets would have the numerical advantage on the battlefield, which proved important, especially with the improvement of battlefield tactics. Yet, on the German side, the new 75mm gun would once again prove another problem when it was mounted on the brand new Panther main battle tank. The Panther could absorb hits from the T-34 before striking with its powerful turret, completely destroying it. This would lead to the creation of the more advanced T-43, designed in 1942. But the question remains why such an impressive battle tank had a casualty rate of 2 crew members each time it was destroyed, and how the Soviets managed to lose more than 40,000 battle tanks by the end of the war. What we didn't mention is the internal workings of the T-34, which was powered by a V12 engine capable of pushing out about 500 horsepower. More powerful than the German tanks, it could traverse more terrains until the massive Tiger II came along. But this massive engine was also prone to failures, especially in the transmission and air filter. Moreover, the tracks tended to snap mid-travel, which often meant that it was either a sitting duck or simply abandoned by the Soviets. Yet, as the war raged on, the Soviets began facing massive shortages. The Germans had pushed closer to Moscow, taking Soviet resources and continuing to bomb facilities. This meant that there was a lack of ammunition for the powerful main turret, and with supply routes cut off, fuel could be transported to the front lines. Moreover, a lack of powerful optics was made worse by the fact that the Soviets tried to push these out as cheaply as possible. And even though it was the most powerful tank on the battlefield, about 7 Soviet tanks were lost for each tank lost by the Germans. By the end of the war, a whopping 44,000 T-34 tanks were lost, including both variations, making it the most overrated tank of the war. Yet Stalin continued pushing them out, famously stating, "Quantity is a quality of its own." Unfortunately, this wouldn't prove to be the case.
Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народом СССР. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
Where the T-34 proved useful was during the Battle of Stalingrad and in slowing down the German advances. In July 1942, Joseph Stalin gave order number 227, not a step back. The Soviets were all instructed to hold their positions, regardless of the German advances, which meant that many T-34s were simply dug into defensive positions. Not having to move around the battlefield proved a massive advantage, allowing them to pick off the enemy as they were approaching. Even though they were still targeted by the Luftwaffe and German tanks, the raids became slower and fewer. The Germans were running out of oil and lacked the logistics to traverse the cold Russian winters to deliver supplies. Meanwhile, the Soviet tank factories were putting hundreds of tanks on the battlefield each week, proving that perhaps quantity might be the best answer. As the Germans lost more territory and now had to fight a war on 2 fronts, the T-34 got its final hurrah. As the Soviets began attacking the Germans, they were closing in on Berlin. While in its massive numbers, it absolutely crippled the German defenses in the city, using its mobility and shorter turrets to destroy the newer Tiger II tank on the battlefield. T-34s can still be seen in Berlin, commemorating the first of these tanks to enter the city on the final day of the war. But as much of a threat as the T-34 was, it wasn't the only powerful tank on the battlefield that almost backfired. The Tiger II was a phenom, and a tank that should have changed the battlefield, but it failed. Check out this video to find out why.